One loyal dog, one locked door, and a silence that screamed louder than any cry for help. No food, no water. Just a collar scar and fading breath. He didn't bark. He didn't run. He waited, because the one person he trusted hadn't come home. But when Officer Ethan Colby returned, he found more than a wounded German Shepherd. He uncovered a secret that would shake the walls of his own home. What happened next will break your heart, then slowly stitch it back together. Before we begin, hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and tap that notification bell so you never miss another story of hope and redemption. The wind curled low through the golden pines of Coldridge, Montana, carrying with it the bite of an early autumn that felt more like winter's warning. Dusk had already crept across the town's quiet streets, painting clapboard houses and weather-worn porches in soft orange and gray. On Sycamore Street, a black police SUV rolled into a narrow driveway, headlights slicing through the thin veil of fog that clung to the earth like memory. Behind the wheel sat Sheriff Ethan Colby, returning home after 6 months away at an advanced tactical leadership course in Colorado. He was 39, with a sturdy frame honed by years of fieldwork and sleepless nights, his brown hair now threaded with gray along the temples. The creases beside his green eyes spoke not just of age, but of things seen and survived. Funerals, raids, storms, and long hours sitting alone with regrets no badge could shield him from. He turned off the ignition and sat there for a moment. The porch light was on, steady, warm, but the house looked still, too still. No scratching at the door, no barking, no soft tap of nails on wood, no Bruno. Ethan's hand gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. Bruno, his 8-year-old German Shepherd, had been more than just a retired canine partner. With rich black and tan fur and sharp, intelligent eyes, Bruno had been trained to detect narcotics and diffuse chaos. But since retirement, he'd become Ethan's companion, his constant. After losing his brother in a raid gone wrong and his former partner to cancer, Bruno had remained, steady, quiet, loyal. Ethan stepped out into the cold. The air smelled of chimney smoke and distant pine sap. Then he saw it. There, on the edge of the porch, barely shielded from the breeze, lay a figure curled into itself. Thin, motionless. Ethan blinked, heart stalling in his chest. It was Bruno, but not the Bruno he remembered. The dog's coat was dull and patchy, ribs showing through his frame. Around his neck, just beneath the matted collar, a red, raw ring of fur told a silent story of friction, of something that had chafed against his skin for days. His paws were curled beneath him, and he didn't rise when Ethan approached. Instead, the German Shepherd let out a soft, trembling whimper, low and broken, a sound closer to a whisper than a cry. Ethan crouched beside him. "Bruno," he said gently. At the sound of his voice, the dog flinched, then stilled. He blinked slowly, and though his body remained frozen in fear or pain, his ears twitched toward Ethan's voice. That was enough. Ethan reached out, carefully sliding a hand beneath Bruno's head, the other under his torso. The dog didn't resist, just shuddered softly, his breath catching with a wheeze that made Ethan's stomach twist. A quiet shuffle came from across the yard. Turning, Ethan saw a familiar figure standing just outside the fence. Mr. Lester, their neighbor from 2 doors down, raised a gloved hand in greeting. He was in his late 60s, with a weathered face and white eyebrows like frost-dusted bristles. A retired auto mechanic, Lester still wore denim overalls and moved with a limp from an old motorcycle crash. "I saw your SUV pull in," he said, voice gravelly. "Didn't think you were back till next week." "Just wrapped early," Ethan said, adjusting his grip on Bruno. "Have you seen him like this long?" Lester scratched the back of his neck. "Been hearing him whimperin' nights, not barkin', not howlin', just them soft, broken sounds, like he was looking for someone who wasn't there. I figured April had it under control." Ethan stiffened. April Lambert Colby. His wife for just over 2 years. She was 25 now, but when they met, she had been barely 20, a girl living out of a storage unit behind the bus station. She had been pale, sick, cold to the bone, with hollow cheeks and eyes too weary for her youth. Ethan had helped her get into a program, then brought her into his world over time. She had grown strong, neat, controlled, but never quite warm. Still, he'd believed in her, married her, offered her the home and the safety she'd never known. Now, holding the half-starved body of his best friend in his arms, Ethan felt the weight of all those assumptions crumbling. "I appreciate you telling me, Mr. Lester," he said tightly. "I'll take care of it." Inside, the house was clean. Too clean. It smelled of lemon and lavender, artificial and polished, not the lived-in comfort he remembered. The rugs were new, the furniture rearranged. The shelf where Bruno's leash once hung was empty. He laid the dog down gently on a folded blanket near the cold fireplace. Bruno curled tighter into himself, paws tucked, tail low, ears flat. He looked more like a cornered fox than the proud dog Ethan remembered. Then came the voice from the hallway. "Ethan?" April stood in the doorway, wearing a charcoal sweater and leggings. Her light auburn hair was pulled into a tidy braid. At 5'7", she moved like someone who measured each step carefully, an echo of years spent surviving on the edge. Her pale face remained unreadable, except for a flicker of surprise that didn't quite reach her light blue eyes. "I didn't expect you tonight," she said, folding her arms loosely. "You didn't text." "Got early release," Ethan replied, standing. "Thought I'd come home to a happy bark." April glanced at the blanket, at the dog. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "He's been difficult." He knocked over a lamp, scratched at the pantry door for hours. "I thought maybe the weather or age was getting to him. I put him outside to calm down." Ethan's voice dropped. "How long was he out there?" "I don't know," she said. "I got distracted. It wasn't on purpose." Ethan didn't answer. He knelt again beside Bruno, stroking the dog's ear gently. The shepherd didn't flinch this time, just exhaled, a long, thin breath that sounded like surrender. Outside, wind rattled the gutters. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then silence. Coldridge had always been a quiet town, but tonight the silence pressed in too close, and deep in his gut Ethan knew something was wrong. The house had gone quiet again. April had disappeared into the kitchen, murmuring something about making tea, but Ethan didn't follow. He sat cross-legged on the living room rug beside Bruno, who hadn't moved from the blanket by the cold hearth. The dog's breath came shallow and spaced, his sides rising with visible effort. Ethan brushed his fingers along the ridge of Bruno's spine, feeling each bone beneath the matted fur. The wind rattled the siding outside. It was darker now, early evening, but the sky over Coldridge had already swallowed its colors. The mountains loomed like watching giants, and the temperature had dropped at least 10 degrees in the last hour. Still, the cold in Ethan's chest came from somewhere deeper. April returned, her footsteps careful, a steaming mug clutched between both hands. Her fingers were small and pale, and her nails, once painted, were now bare. She held out the mug toward him like an offering. "You look tired," she said. Ethan didn't take it. "Why was he locked out?" "I told you, he was acting out," she answered softly. "Scratching the walls, growling at nothing. I thought maybe something was wrong with his head." Ethan's jaw tensed. "He's not some broken appliance, April. He's a dog. My dog." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "I was just trying to manage things while you were gone." Ethan looked around the living room, at the new decor, the carefully curated minimalism. It looked more like a hotel suite than the home he'd left behind. Bruno had once had a bed in the corner, a basket of toys, a water bowl by the window. All gone. "Where did you keep him during the day?" There was the briefest pause. "In the laundry room," she said. "Only when I wasn't home." Ethan stood. "Show me." April hesitated, then led him down the narrow hallway. At the end of it, a door stood slightly ajar. She reached for the handle, but Ethan brushed past her and pushed it open fully. The room hit him like a slap. It was windowless, with concrete walls and exposed pipes that wept condensation. The air smelled of mildew and something sharper, Urine, maybe. A crate sat in the corner, too small for a dog Bruno's size. Beside it, a plastic water bowl was overturned and dry. Torn scraps of an old towel lay in a corner like a failed attempt at bedding. Ethan turned to her, voice low. "He was in here?" April looked away. "For how long?" Her arms crossed over her chest. "Sometimes just an hour. Sometimes a little longer. He got so aggressive I didn't know what else to do." Ethan's hand rested on the doorframe. His fingers dug into the wood. "Did he bite you? Did he ever growl at you?" "No," she whispered. He stepped fully into the room. In the far corner, behind a stacked hamper and a box of cleaning supplies, he noticed scratch marks, dozens of them, carved deep into the wall. Paw marks. Desperate. Repeated. Ethan's chest tightened. Bruno had been trying to claw his way out. In the dim light, another memory surfaced, so vivid it nearly knocked the breath from him. A winter night, 5 years ago. Patrol had been quiet. Then a call from dispatch, a possible trespasser near the old storage units by the bus depot. Ethan had responded himself. He'd found April there, 17, thin as a branch, trembling under a pile of blankets in a storage unit filled with moldy clothes and empty food wrappers. She'd looked up at him with eyes full of panic, then shame. She hadn't spoken at first, just clutched a photograph of a woman Ethan later learned was her mother, lost to opioids a year earlier. He hadn't written her up. Instead, he'd brought her to the station, called social services, and paid out of pocket for a room at a halfway shelter. He visited weekly. Sometimes she'd talk. Sometimes she'd just listen. She started volunteering. She got clean. When she turned 20, they started seeing each other. A year later, they married. He'd told himself it wasn't pity, that it was love, that it could grow from the soil of something broken. But now, standing in that room, surrounded by the evidence of neglect and silence, Ethan wondered if he had misjudged it all. He turned back to her. "Why didn't you call me?" "I didn't want to worry you." "April, he was your responsibility." Her face twitched. "And I never asked for that. I never wanted a dog that big or that old. I only took care of him because he mattered to you." Ethan stared at her. "And now he doesn't?" She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came. Instead, she turned and walked back down the hall. Bruno let out a soft whine from the living room, barely audible. Ethan stepped back into the hallway, then paused. On impulse, he opened the hall closet. Small, narrow, where they kept old coats and boots. At the bottom, half buried under a stack of worn jackets, he saw it. Bruno's old leash. The leather was cracked. The metal clip bent. But it was there. Next to it, his favorite rope toy, chewed at both ends, still faintly smelling of pine from the last camping trip they took. She hadn't thrown them out. She'd hidden them. He closed the door. Downstairs, April sat in silence on the couch, phone in hand but untouched. Her expression was unreadable. "I'm taking him to the vet tomorrow," Ethan said. She didn't respond. "He sleeps in my room tonight, on my bed." Still, silence. Ethan walked back into the living room and lowered himself next to Bruno. The dog shifted slightly and pressed his head against Ethan's knee. That small gesture broke something in Ethan. He sat there for hours, hand resting on the dog's neck, as Coleridge went to sleep around him. The next morning broke with a dull gray light bleeding in through the blinds, casting long shadows across the wooden floorboards. Coleridge had woken to a sky the color of pewter and a cold front pushing in from the north. The house was silent. April had already left. Her boots were gone from the entryway, and the smell of her perfume no longer lingered in the air. Ethan sat on the floor of the living room beside Bruno, who was still curled tightly on the blanket by the fireplace, his body shivering slightly despite the warmth from the vent above. Ethan hadn't slept much. He'd closed his eyes here and there, but every creak of the house snapped him awake. It wasn't just worry. It was suspicion, and that kind of unrest rooted deep, like splinters under the skin. After brewing a bitter cup of coffee, he moved room by room through the house. There had to be answers here, evidence not of an event, but of a pattern. And patterns never stayed hidden forever. He began in the hallway closet. Pulling out boots, scarves, and a box of tangled Christmas lights, he dug deeper until his fingers touched leather. He pulled out a worn dog leash, Bruno's old one, with a frayed edge and a cut strap that looked as though it had been sliced deliberately, not broken by force. He turned it over in his hands, the brass clasp cool and oxidized with disuse. He found the food bowls next, stacked under the kitchen sink, behind bottles of detergent and bleach. The water bowl still had grime at the base, a ring of dust and dried residue telling him it hadn't been used in weeks. The food bowl was clean, too clean, scrubbed like someone trying to erase a trace of presence. And then, in the guest room closet, shoved far into the back behind a pile of folded towels, he saw something that made his breath catch: a stuffed bear. It was torn across the belly, one eye missing, the other dangling by a thread. Its stuffing had started to come loose from the seam, but Ethan would have recognized it anywhere. This wasn't just a toy. It was Bruno's bear, the one he'd carried into his kennel every night, the one he used to bury under his blanket like a treasure. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed and turned the bear over in his hands. The fabric still held a faint doggy scent. Faded, but there. He felt a tightness in his chest that wasn't quite rage and wasn't quite grief, just something in between, something like betrayal. He carried the bear back into the living room, crouched beside Bruno, and gently set it down beside the dog's head. Bruno stirred at the familiar scent. He didn't lift his head, but his eyes fluttered open and locked on the toy. Then, with aching slowness, his paw shifted and drew it close. Ethan's throat closed. He sat back, leaning against the wall. Outside, sleet had started to drift across the windows, tapping like restless fingers, and in the haze of sleeplessness a memory took him. 5 years ago. It was dusk in Coldridge, though the town had looked different then, rougher, before the renovations came through the historic district. Ethan had been tracking a suspect from a local arms trafficking ring, one who'd gone off the radar after a bust in Helena. The call had come from a convenience store clerk who said a man matching the suspect's description had been seen skulking behind the freezer units out back. Ethan had gone in solo. The alley behind the store was narrow, with a dumpster and 2 exit doors, one locked, one swinging slightly ajar. Bruno had been younger then, his gait strong, his eyes sharp. He hadn't barked. He never needed to. Ethan had trusted him without question. They'd approached the door. Ethan remembered the sound first, a click, faint, almost missed beneath the hum of the dumpster's power line. Then the door slammed open, and the suspect, a man in his late 30s with a shaved head and military boots, lunged out, a sawed-off shotgun raised. Ethan didn't have time to react. Bruno did. The dog launched forward, colliding with the man's chest, sending both of them sprawling. The shotgun discharged into the air, the blast shattering a floodlight overhead. Ethan had tackled the weapon away while Bruno kept the suspect pinned. It was over in 30 seconds. But Ethan remembered the blood. Not from the suspect, from Bruno. A pellet had grazed his shoulder in the scuffle. He hadn't whimpered. Hadn't moved until Ethan gave the all-clear. That night, at the station, as the vet patched Bruno up on a metal table, Ethan had sat beside him, one hand on his fur, whispering things he hadn't said aloud in years. Promises. Gratitude. A simple truth. You saved me. That moment had bound them, not by training, not by command, but by choice. Now, looking at Bruno's gaunt frame curled around that battered bear, Ethan felt the sting of memory sharpen into purpose. He wasn't just trying to understand what had happened. He was preparing to make it right. The clouds still hung low over Coldridge as Ethan stepped out onto the front porch that afternoon, hands tucked into the pockets of his flannel-lined jacket. The chill in the air had deepened, the kind that slipped into your bones even before winter's first snow. Bruno lay curled just inside the screen door, wrapped in a blanket, eyes half-lidded, but tracking Ethan's every move with quiet loyalty. Across the street, wind tugged at the corners of a faded American flag hanging from the porch rail of an old house with weather-beaten siding. It belonged to Mrs. Connie Weller, a woman Ethan had known since he first moved into the neighborhood 7 years ago. In her mid-70s, Connie was small and angular, with silver-gray hair usually pulled into a clip at the nape of her neck. She wore oversized cardigans year-round and always had a paperback mystery tucked under one arm. People in town called her reserved, maybe a little brittle, but polite to a fault. Her late husband had died of Parkinson's a decade ago, and since then she'd mostly kept to herself, except when it came to her rose bushes or her watchful eye on the street. Ethan crossed over and gently tapped the wrought-iron gate that separated her porch from the sidewalk. Connie was already there, standing in the doorway with a cup of tea in both hands. "I was wondering when you'd come," she said, voice like creased paper. "You look tired, Sheriff." "Not Sheriff today," Ethan replied. "Just a neighbor." Connie nodded and stepped back, letting him onto the porch. The house smelled faintly of Earl Grey and old cedar. They sat on a pair of wicker chairs near the window, the cushion beneath Ethan creaking with age. "I need to ask you something," he said quietly. "I figured you would," she replied, watching him over the rim of her cup. "Have you noticed anything unusual across the street lately, while I was away?" Connie didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked out across the road toward Ethan's home, her lips tight. Then she sighed, long and reluctant. "I heard things," she said. "A few times, not always. Yelling. A man's voice, deep, not yours, sounded angry. And one night, I thought I heard something break. Glass, maybe. Or a door." Ethan felt his chest tighten. "Why didn't you say anything?" Connie's eyes flicked back to him. "Because the last time I got involved in someone else's business, it didn't end well. A neighbor down on Glendon Street thought her grandson was being abused. Turned out it was nothing. She lost her friendship, and the boy stopped coming by altogether. I wasn't going to be the gossiping old widow poking into other people's lives." Ethan nodded slowly, trying to suppress the frustration rising in his throat. "Did you see anyone? Someone coming to the house?" Connie hesitated. There was a man. Tall, wiry, maybe in his 20s. Short hair, dark hoodie. I saw him twice. Once in the early afternoon, once late at night, maybe close to midnight. Both times when April was home alone. "Did he knock? Use the front door?" "Walked in like he belonged there," she said simply. Ethan looked down at his hands, knuckles white. "Do you know who he is?" "No, but April, she looked nervous. First time I waved to her with him there, she barely looked my way. The second time she pulled the blinds." Silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant rustle of dry leaves skittering along the curb. "I should have said something," Connie murmured, "but I didn't want to assume the worst." "You didn't have to," Ethan said, standing. "Thank you for telling me." She placed her hand gently on his sleeve. "Be careful, Ethan. Not just for you, for that dog, too." He nodded and turned to head back across the street. Inside the house, the air felt colder than outside. April wasn't in the living room. Her keys were gone from the hook. The quiet was oppressive now, like a weight pressing on the walls. Ethan stepped into the kitchen. On the counter lay her phone. She'd left it unlocked. He shouldn't have looked. But he did. The messages were recent, from someone labeled only as D. The latest read, "I don't care what you told him. You think you're safe with him now? You think he'll believe you forever? I'll be watching." Another, from 2 days earlier, "I don't like that dog watching me. Next time I won't be gentle." Ethan's blood ran cold. He clicked open the contact. The name was Derek Marlowe. Ethan knew the name, knew the record. Derek had been flagged a year ago in a minor assault case. Bar fight, no charges pressed. He was known for disappearing off-grid for months at a time. Ethan had never connected him to April before, but now. Bruno let out a low, hoarse breath from the living room. Ethan placed the phone back where he found it and walked slowly to the fireplace. He crouched beside the dog, placing a steadying hand on his back. "You saw him, didn't you?" he whispered. Bruno didn't react, but he didn't have to. Ethan now had a name, and a storm was building. The air in Coldridge had grown brittle with the approach of winter. Morning frost etched the windows in delicate webs, and the silence inside Ethan's home had shifted from hollow to haunted. Bruno barely moved from the corner by the fireplace anymore, save for when Ethan walked near. The moment his footsteps slowed, the dog's ears twitched. Not in joy, but in quiet anticipation of danger. Ethan noticed it that morning, the way Bruno recoiled slightly when a neighbor's voice carried through the open window. The sudden twitch when a commercial on the radio played a male voice too deep, too sharp, and, most telling, the untouched bowl of chicken broth Ethan had left near his front paws. Not even sniffed. He'd seen trauma before, in war veterans, in abused kids, in other canines pulled from the wreckage of raids gone wrong, but seeing it in Bruno, a dog once brave enough to lunge into gunfire, made something in Ethan tighten like a snare. By late afternoon, Ethan was in the garage, crouched beside a battered toolbox, sorting through equipment. He wasn't just looking for clues anymore, he was preparing. He pulled out a small black case containing a set of microsurveillance cameras. Old department issue, still functional. They were no larger than shirt buttons, with a wide-angle lens and wireless feed capability. He had used them years ago in an undercover op targeting a smuggling ring through logging trucks. Now, they'd serve a quieter war. He mounted one just inside the hallway vent, facing the living room, another beneath the shelf in the kitchen, one near the laundry room door, and a fourth angled toward the back entrance where the floorboard creaked, a sound Derek likely didn't know betrayed him. That night, he didn't sleep in his bedroom. Instead, he set up camp on the living room couch with a blanket and a tablet connected to the live camera feed. Bruno lay nearby, head on Ethan's boot, trembling slightly in his dreams. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. At 2:46 a.m., the camera facing the back door flickered. A shape moved outside. Ethan sat upright, pulse tightening. The door handle turned slowly. It creaked open. Derek stepped in, moving like a shadow. He was in his mid-20s, tall and wiry with a predator's posture. Shoulders hunched, eyes scanning the room like a thief casing a mark. He wore a dark hoodie, black jeans, and cheap sneakers that didn't make a sound. His face was long and narrow, with a faint scar trailing down from the left brow, a remnant of a past he probably didn't speak about. Ethan didn't move. He watched. Derek crept into the kitchen, opened a cabinet, grabbed a protein bar, and then crossed into the living room, straight toward Bruno. Bruno raised his head, stiffened, and then Derek snarled. "What? You think you're special?" he hissed under his breath, crouching. "You just a mutt, you hear me?" Bruno cowered, tail tucked so tightly it disappeared beneath his belly. Derek lashed out, a hard kick to the side of Bruno's ribs, sharp and sudden. Ethan gripped the couch arm until his knuckles blanched white. Bruno whimpered, but didn't yelp. He collapsed further into the floor, shaking. Derek leaned in, spat words Ethan couldn't fully hear but could guess. The dog trembled violently. That was all Ethan needed. He stood, moved to the hallway, and deliberately let the floorboard creak. Derek froze. "You're in the wrong house," Ethan called out, voice calm but iron-edged. Derek bolted. By the time Ethan reached the kitchen, the back door was swinging open, and the cold night air swept in like judgment. But it didn't matter. Ethan had it all on video. The next morning, Ethan drove to the Coldridge Police Department. The brick building sat beside a modest post office and a family diner, quiet at that hour, but familiar. The receptionist, Tara, a warm-faced woman in her 50s with cropped gray curls and reading glasses perpetually perched on her head, blinked in surprise when she saw him. "You're supposed to be on leave," she said. "Not today," Ethan replied. "I need to file a formal complaint. Animal cruelty and unlawful entry." Tara's expression sobered. "You want a supervisor?" "No," Ethan said. "I want internal to see this." He handed over the USB drive containing the footage. She took it wordlessly and nodded. Back home, Bruno hadn't moved much. Ethan sat beside him, stroked his fur gently, whispering the same words over and over. "You're safe now. I've got you." But Bruno's eyes no longer lifted. They stayed half shut, like he no longer trusted daylight to mean peace. The town of Coldridge lay under a blanket of silence that night, the streets glazed with frost, streetlights casting long halos through the freezing mist. Ethan sat in his truck outside the precinct parking lot, engine running, wipers brushing away thin layers of sleet on the windshield. The USB drive containing the footage from the hidden cameras sat on the passenger seat beside him like a loaded weapon. This wasn't just personal anymore, it was a case, and he was ready to pursue it by the book, but he wouldn't be doing it alone. Officer Megan Ruiz stood waiting for him inside the small side entrance to the Coldridge Police Department. Megan, in her early 30s, had a compact, athletic frame and a sharp gaze that missed nothing. Her olive skin and tight black braid were familiar sights to anyone who'd spent time in the field with her. She was known for her dry wit and her ability to keep calm even in the most chaotic scenes, traits that made her both reliable and respected. Ethan had worked several difficult narcotics busts with her back in the day, and he trusted her judgment like he trusted few others. When she saw him, her arms crossed and her jaw tightened. "You sure you're ready for this?" she asked. He gave a curt nod. "I've got what I need. I just need a judge to see it the same way." They made their way into a back office where Megan booted up the internal evidence terminal and began cataloging the footage. She played the segment of Derek entering through the back door, the kick, the muttered threats, the whimper from Bruno. Megan didn't speak until the end of the clip. When she did, her voice was cold steel. "You want a search warrant, you'll get it. I'll file the emergency petition tonight. Judge Hewitt's on duty for midnight rotation." By 12:13 a.m., they had it in hand. They drove in silence back to Ethan's house, joined by Deputy Shane O'Connell, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 40s with thinning hair and a thick Maine accent, known for his firm but fair approach. Shane had always been more old school, didn't care for paperwork, but had a nose for when something didn't smell right. He'd volunteered for this late-night operation without hesitation. When they pulled into Ethan's driveway, the street was dark except for the soft glow from a porch light 2 doors down. April's car wasn't in the drive. She was likely still at her friend Clara's, a detail Ethan had confirmed earlier when he'd seen the location tag on her social media. Ethan unlocked the front door slowly, motioning for Megan and Shane to follow. The house was still, heat hissing through the vents. Bruno lifted his head from the living room rug but didn't move, only watched. They started with the garage. The moment Ethan lifted the latch, the sharp metallic scent hit them first. Faint, but distinct. The garage had been recently rearranged. Boxes stacked high, an old bike moved to block part of the far wall. But behind the clutter, they found it. A metal crate, medium-sized, rusting in spots, with a door that hung open awkwardly. Inside, a few strands of dog hair clung to the corner. Next to it, under a tarp, lay a short piece of plastic piping, cracked and dark-stained at one end. Shane bent down and picked it up, sniffed the end, then raised an eyebrow. "Blood," he said, "and not old." Megan found something else. A hidden, wall-mounted camera, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. She pressed a button at the base, and the light blinked red, then green. "Still active," she said. "Let's check the feed." They brought the camera into the living room and connected it to Ethan's tablet. The footage loaded with a flicker, revealing multiple clips over the last few weeks. Derek entering the garage from the side door, dragging Bruno by the collar, forcing him into the crate, raising the pipe and striking down. Ethan looked away. "This is more than enough," Megan said. "We've got assault, cruelty, unlawful entry, and tampering with private property." April returned home at 2:31 a.m., the rumble of her car tires on gravel breaking the silence. She stepped inside wearing a beige coat, cheeks flushed from the cold. When she saw them, Ethan, Megan, and Shane, she froze, keys still in hand. "What's going on?" Megan stepped forward. "April Lambert Colby, we need you to answer a few questions regarding the treatment of a registered service animal in your household." April's mouth tightened. I don't know what this is about." "We have footage," Ethan said softly, "from multiple days, of Derek, and of you letting it happen." April's lips trembled. I didn't know he was hurting Bruno. He told me he was just helping to train him. Ethan took a deep breath, voice steady. We found the pipe, April. We saw the bruises, and we saw you in the frame, walking away. For a moment, she didn't move. Then her shoulders slumped. I was scared, she whispered. He said if I told anyone, he'd hurt me too, or ruin you. I didn't want to lose everything you gave me. I didn't know what to do. You could have told me, Ethan said. April shook her head. I didn't want to be weak again. You saved me once already. I couldn't ask you to save me again. Tears began to spill down her cheeks. Megan's tone softened. You're not under arrest right now, April, but we will need a formal statement. If you were threatened, we'll record that as part of the investigation. April nodded slowly, defeated. Shane opened the door and stepped out to call dispatch. Ethan stood in the hallway alone for a moment, breathing in the stillness. Then he turned back to Bruno, who had crept closer, the bear still in his mouth. You're not going back in the dark, Ethan whispered. Not ever. The courthouse in downtown Coldridge was modest, a 3-story brick structure tucked between the old library and the post office, with white pillars flanking its stone steps and the American flag fluttering stiffly in the frigid wind. On this winter morning, the sky was a flat gray sheet, and the air smelled faintly of snow yet to fall. Ethan sat alone on the front bench outside courtroom 3B, his uniform left at home, his civilian jacket zipped high against the cold. In his hand he held a photo, Bruno as a pup, ears too big for his head, sitting proudly beside a younger version of himself. The door creaked open behind him. Detective Valerie Chen, the prosecutor assigned to the case, stepped out. Valerie was in her early 40s, with a sleek black bob tucked behind her ears and a sharp, focused expression that rarely softened. She had the calm, confident poise of someone who had spent decades dissecting truth from half-truth, and though she spoke little, every word she chose mattered. Her tailored navy pantsuit looked crisp despite the long hours. It's done, she said, voice low. Judge Marin handed down the sentence 5 minutes ago. Ethan stood. And? Derek Marlowe, 2 years, state prison. 1 count of felony animal cruelty, 1 count unlawful entry, 1 count criminal intimidation. No parole until 18 months served. Ethan let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. And April? Probation, Valerie said. 1 year, mandatory counseling, court-ordered no contact with animals, and a psychological review every 90 days. Ethan nodded, his jaw tight. She's not a bad person, just lost. Valerie glanced toward the frosted window. Maybe, but lost people can still cause damage. He didn't reply. An hour later, in a separate room filled with muted carpeting and the buzz of fluorescent lights, Ethan signed the final page of the divorce petition. It had been sitting on his desk for weeks, unsigned, untouched. Now, it felt like the last stone in a long dam collapsing quietly into the river below. The notary, Carol Bridges, a kind-faced woman in her 50s with horn-rimmed glasses and a faint southern drawl, handled it without comment. She'd been through this process with hundreds of couples, and she offered Ethan nothing more than a soft, "Take care now," as she stamped the final seal. Ethan left the courthouse and drove in silence to the Riverside Companion Recovery Center, a veterinary trauma facility on the outskirts of town. Nestled between frost-coated pines, the clinic had a wide wraparound porch, large glass windows, and a sign painted in soft sage green. Inside, the air was clean, faintly eucalyptus-scented, and blessedly warm. Behind the reception desk sat Dr. Teresa Hayworth, the head of Animal Trauma Services. Teresa was in her mid-30s with a gentle but no-nonsense demeanor. She wore scrubs beneath a thick cardigan, her dark curly hair pulled into a bun, and her warm hazel eyes always looked just a little tired in the way all caretakers do. She had met Bruno 2 days earlier, and the bond had been immediate. "He's resting," she said, "eating small meals, still nervous around strangers, but he let Mason pet him this morning." "Mason?" Ethan asked. "My 5-year-old son," she said, smiling faintly. He's very quiet with animals. Teresa led him to a back recovery room. There, nestled on a large padded bed surrounded by soft lighting and a plush blanket, was Bruno. His fur had been washed, though still patchy in places. His eyes lit up faintly when he saw Ethan. No bark, no wag, just recognition. Ethan knelt, and Bruno slowly stretched forward, pressing his snout gently into Ethan's chest. "I missed you too, buddy," Ethan whispered. He stayed there for a long while, his hand resting behind Bruno's ears, fingers moving gently in the spot he always loved. For the first time in weeks, Bruno closed his eyes, not from exhaustion, but trust. Outside, snow began to fall. The lake shimmered in the afternoon sun, framed by tall pines dusted with snow. It was early spring in Coldridge's northern hills, one of those rare days where the cold had begun to loosen its grip but hadn't quite left. The cabin sat tucked beneath a gentle slope, its wooden frame stained dark by years of weather but lovingly maintained. Smoke curled from the chimney, and a pair of Adirondack chairs faced the water like silent sentinels. The world here felt slower, kinder. Ethan stepped out onto the porch, cradling a mug of coffee. His jeans were dusted with sawdust from repairing the back step earlier that morning, and a flannel shirt hung loose on his frame. He looked leaner these days, more weathered but more grounded too, like someone who had walked through fire and now stood in its warm, flickering light. At the edge of the porch lay Bruno, stretched out in a patch of sun, eyes half-lidded in contentment. His coat had grown back and soft and thick, with only a few pink patches where old scars still lingered. The old stuffed bear sat beside him, now patched with careful stitching and washed to softness. Bruno's tail gave a slow wag when Ethan moved, and when he approached, the German shepherd gave a soft, low bark, not alarmed, but familiar, full of memory and peace. "Hey, buddy," Ethan said, kneeling down. Bruno nudged his muzzle into Ethan's chest, letting out a slow huff of air. They'd been here 3 weeks. After the trial, Ethan had taken leave from the force and quietly sold the house. The cabin had once belonged to his uncle, a retired forest ranger who'd passed it down to Ethan in his will. For years, it had been nothing more than a weekend escape, a fishing spot, a place to breathe. Now, it was home. He looked around, eyes settling on the modest touches he'd begun to build. A rack for Bruno's toys by the door, a new leash hook, food bowls by the window where the sun came in strongest. On the far end of the living room, a photo of them together, taken by a fellow officer years ago, sat in a pine wood frame. Ethan had added something else too, a carved wooden sign by the door that read, "All are welcome who walk in peace." The gravel shifted on the driveway behind him. Ethan turned to see a familiar silver SUV pulling in. He smiled before he even registered it. The car door opened, and Officer Megan Ruiz stepped out, bundled in a quilted forest green jacket and jeans, a reusable canvas bag slung over her shoulder. "I brought snacks," she called, "and a very judgmental chew toy." Ethan grinned as he walked to greet her. Megan's dark braid had been let out today, falling over one shoulder, and her brown eyes sparkled despite the cold. "You really didn't have to," Ethan said as he took the bag. "I did," she replied, stepping up onto the porch. "Bruno deserves better than dry kibble and whatever mystery meat you're feeding him." "I feed him chicken," Ethan protested. "Sure," Megan deadpanned. "Chicken from a can labeled Poultry Product Number 7. They both laughed. Bruno rose to his feet and padded over, pressing his head against Megan's hip. She rubbed behind his ears. "Looks like someone remembers me." "He never forgets good people," Ethan said, voice soft. She turned to him then, face more serious. "You doing okay out here?" Ethan nodded. "I think for the first time in a long while. Yeah, I am." There was a pause, comfortable, then Megan glanced around. "You really fixed this place up. It's quiet." "That's the point." He opened the front door and motioned her inside. The interior of the cabin was warm and welcoming. Wooden beams crossed overhead, and the scent of pine and cedar hung in the air. A fire crackled in the hearth, and a simple table held 2 steaming mugs Ethan had prepared earlier, one with lemon and honey, just the way Megan liked. She looked touched. "You remembered." "I remember a lot of things now," he said. She settled onto the couch while Bruno curled at her feet, chewing on a new rope toy shaped like a squirrel. Ethan sat across from her, leaning back. The tension in his shoulders eased for the first time in what felt like years. "You know," Megan said, looking around, "this place, it suits you. The space, the quiet, the dog hair." Ethan chuckled. "Yeah, it's not perfect, but it's honest." She looked at him then, holding his gaze. Sometimes honest is exactly what we need. He stood and walked to the door, opening it wide so the sunlight spilled in. The lake glistened beyond, birds chirping faintly in the trees. Turning back to her, Ethan said, "There's always a place here for people who know how to listen." Megan smiled, rising to her feet, the late afternoon light catching in her eyes. Behind them, Bruno let out a contented sigh and rested his head on his paws. Outside, the light continued to fall gently at the foot of the hill, where healing, at long last, had taken root. We don't get to choose where our story begins, but we can choose who walks beside us as it continues. Bruno wasn't just a dog in need of a home. He was a reminder of everything we too often forget, that loyalty survives silence, that healing can be quiet, and that love, real, steadfast love, sometimes arrives on 4 legs, carrying a worn-out toy and a wounded heart. In a world that moves too fast, where pain hides behind polite smiles and quiet walls, Bruno brought light into the dark corners. He didn't just find a new home, he reignited memory. He reconnected the lonely. He became the keeper of things left behind. Maybe you've known a Bruno. Maybe you are one. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who might need it. Leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell for more stories of courage, kindness, and quiet redemption. And may God bless you for watching, for feeling, and for remembering that sometimes the smallest souls carry the greatest grace.